But what is the Liben lark? And this is actually quite a complex and interesting question, which we've only just really sorted out. In fact, there'll be a paper appearing any day now in the Journal of Ornithology, which presents the results that you're about to see. So kind of you're hearing this first. And to answer this question, we have to take a little tour back through history. So this is Ethiopia, and there are three key places here. The Liben Plain down in the south here, obviously, familiar, Liben being a familiar name associated with the lark. The town of Jijiga over in eastern Ethiopia, and then the Liben Plains, which is just over the border in Somaliland. And the story begins in 1918, when Geoffrey Archer, who was the governor of British Somaliland then, collected a new species of lark from the Liben Plains, and he quite rightly recognised that this was the same genus as Rudd's lark of South Africa, another Heteromerophora. And he named that Heteromerophora, or he didn't name it himself, it was named in his honour Heteromerophora archeri, Archer's lark. And then in 1968, Christian Erard collected a species of lark on the Liben Plains, but it wasn't for a few years until he recognised that this was something new and unusual and interesting. And that was named Sidamo lark at the time, Heteromerophora sidamoensis. And then in 2011, a Heteromerophora lark was seen and photographed near the town of Jijiga. So what's the relationship between these three populations? So the key population here is this new one in Jijiga. Is this one of Archer's birds from here? Or is this one of the Liben birds from here? Or are they all three different species? Or are they all three one species? So this was a question that we looked at. This is one of the Jijiga birds. And when somebody sent me this photograph, I immediately said, well, this looks just like the birds we're studying on the Liben Plain. But very shortly after the bird was found, Claire Spottiswoode, who many of you will know, I think, at least by name, if not not in person, and Nigel Collar, who, again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, went to Jijiga and actually managed to catch a couple of these birds. And Claire took detailed measurements and took some blood samples, and we've just got the results of all these analyses. So this is the Jijiga bird. To my eyes, very, very similar to the Liben Lark. I haven't been over to Jijiga, but very, very similar plumage, measurements, and so forth. And what the results show quite clearly, this is the results of the genetic analyses. The birds from the Liben Plain, sidamoensis, we've got some DNA from Archer's old specimens from footpad scrapings, and the Jijiga birds are all one and the same thing, but quite distinctive in several ways, not least genetically, as you can see from this, quite distinctive from Rudd's lark. So the genus Heteromerophora has not got three species, as was originally thought, it's got two species. So a kind of little timeline. 1922, Archer's lark was found in Somaliland. 1968, Sidamo lark was described from the Liben Plain, and then that was renamed. The English name was changed in 2009 by BirdLife for two reasons. Firstly, because the Sidamo district no longer exists, and secondly, because local people on the Liben Plains thought that calling the bird, naming the bird after the Liben Plains might help to engender local support for it. So BirdLife changed the English name from Sidamo lark to Liben Lark in 2009. And then in 2011, this taxon was found at Jijiga, and what we know now is that all three are the same bird. Now, because Archeri was described first, the English name has been kept the same, but the scientific name has changed. So both the English name and the scientific name of the birds on the Liben Plain has changed in the last few years. Complicated? Well, what it seems increasingly likely to be the case is that this population in Somaliland no longer exists. So we're left now with two small isolated populations, one up near Jijiga and one down in the south of Ethiopia on the Liben Plain. This Somaliland population has been searched for several times, and the area where Archer collected his birds is now just crops. It's all gone. And that supposition that these are the only two populations is borne out by some what we call environmental niche modelling that we've been doing. So what we do is we tell the computer where we record our birds, these green dots. So this is a blown up area of the Liben Plain, and this is the Jijiga area here, blown up here. And what we do is the model then looks around all over the southern Ethiopia, looking for places that have the same environment as where we recorded those birds. That's kind of how it works in a nutshell. And the model is the red areas, so it's suggesting that there may be some sites around the Liben Plain that we haven't recorded birds on that may be suitable. Similarly, in the Jijiga area. But other than these two areas, there's pretty much nothing that looks suitable for this species. There's kind of a few little, maybe you can just see a few little dots here, 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 here. We haven't actually visited these. We're going to try and get to this one this year. But it seems quite unlikely that there's going to be any other populations outside the Liben Plain and this rather degraded area just outside Jijiga. And presumably at one point these would have been connected. Indeed, our genetic analyses suggest that these two populations were genetically intermixed until relatively recently. But all this area here, which used to be grassland, Ethiopia's southern rangeland, is all now the crops or other land use types. So we left these two tiny little disjunct populations. Now, the problem we have researching this species is that this area up here is currently insecure. It's very close to the border with Somaliland. There are various problems there. So we can't get there to do any research on this species. We still don't really know how many birds there are there, what sort of state the habitat's in. So all the work that we've been doing recently, and this is where Brooke Tarbutt's doing her work, is down on the Liben Plains in southern Ethiopia. This is a picture of the Liben Plain. Something like about 25 square kilometres of grassland left, but disappearing at a very frightening rate. Home of the Borana people. In fact, we found out recently that this is the Liben Plain is the ancestral home of the Borana people, so we're hoping to use that to kind of build a kind of identity for the place. Not many people actually live out on the plain. There are just a few little scattered huts in the area. But you can see from this how short the grassland is and how much bare ground there is in there. And this is very overgrazed, very degraded grassland. We know that when Erard was collecting there in the late 60s, that the grassland was kind of chest height. And now it's like this. It's almost like a kind of a billiard table in a way. This area here, incidentally, these are harvester ant nests. So this isn't overgrazed, and this is a harvester ant nest. But you can see these other areas here. It's very, very heavily grazed, very overgrazed. And the problem is that the area of grassland is shrinking, but the number of cows is staying the same. So inevitably, you get more cows per unit area of grassland. Pastoralists are very poor, and there have been quite a large number of moves to kind of repress the kind of transhumance that these people used to do. They used to undertake migrations with their cattle. They had an extremely sophisticated system of rangeland management called the Gadar, which involved taking cows to certain places at certain times, exchanging knowledge about rainfall. Very, very sophisticated way of managing their grasslands. But of course, governments tend not to like people moving around and crossing borders and so forth. So the governments of Ethiopia has been very keen to sedentarize people by building water holes for them, so there's less incentive to move around, by building schools and villages for them, so there's less incentive to move around and so forth. And this kind of traditional rangeland management is really rather dying out. It's only the older people now who still remember the intricacies of the Gadar. So the first expedition we made, I wasn't there, Claire Spottiswoode and Nigel Collar made, was in 2007, and they set up, this is a Landsat image of the area, set up a series of transects, these dotted lines. You can see the grassland falls into two major areas, on this side, on this side. This brown area is scrubland, villages, crops, that sort of thing. So the grass is the greeny blue type colouring on this map. And we've been running these transects every year since then. And this shows some of the results. You can see that the different coloured dots represent the larks that we record from these transects in different years. And there are some very interesting patterns. So this area down here, for example, which we've walked these transects tens of times, we've never recorded birds there. The same up here. And to our eyes, this grassland looks exactly like this grassland here, where we record lots of birds. So still there's a lot we don't understand about the fine-scale habitat use of this peculiar species. The results of these counts suggest that there are 100, maybe as many as 250 territories, I think probably rather on the lower side of that, and that they tend to be clustered, as I say, and that some areas that appeared to be suitable, to our eyes at least, we've never recorded birds on. They're recorded only on open treeless grassland, so you can get some nice grassland, but if it's got a tree in it, a bit like skylarks, they won't go near it, and that's presumably because predators use trees as lookout points. And they select areas of taller and denser grass than average. So what we've been doing is we've been taking quite detailed habitat measurements at random points and then at points where we've recorded the bird. And the places where the birds are, the grass is significantly more extensive and taller than it is in places where the bird is not. So clearly they're clinging onto these little patches, and that is all they are now, little patches of slightly taller grass. We think, and a common pattern amongst declining species, we think there are more males than females. In fact, we were very worried a couple of years ago. We ran all the transects and we didn't see a single female. You can't always sex them, but you can often sex them in the field. And we think there's probably very low nesting success. Around about 5 nests so far, and 3 of them were predated. In one case, in fact, the female was predated on the nest. And that's possibly one of the reasons why you get this imbalance in the adult sex ratio. The females get predated during incubation. Only the females incubate, so far as we know. That's the case in most larks. More worryingly, we've identified a number of crops, and I think a number of threats. Sorry, and I think the most serious threat is the spread of crops into the area. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. In fact, it's a very recent phenomenon. It's actually started since we've been going there in the last 6 or 7 years. And what's happening is that people from outside the area are coming in and illegally buying or renting areas of land and investing money in growing crops there, in growing cereals there. The local people don't want this, of course. The local people are pastoralists. They need grassland. So there's been a lot of local conflict as well. Overgrazing is a problem, obviously, as I say. If the area of grassland is declining and the herd size stayed the same, you're going to get overgrazing. And that leads to soil erosion. There's terrible soil erosion in places, which makes it very difficult for the grassland to re-establish. And then in the eastern end of the eastern side of the plain particularly is a big problem with encroachment of scrub, because people are no longer allowed to burn the grass. Anyway, there's not enough grass to hold the fire anyway. So what's happening now is the scrub is marching in, and there is also invasive plants moving in from the south as well. And then I think there's, again, because the grassland is so short, we think there's this big problem of predation. And this is a picture I took a couple of years ago. You can see all this area now, this rich green area here, going right the way into the distance. That's all wheat. And these guys are ploughing up this area of grass. The birds singing around here, that's all gone under wheat now. And I think that in the last 5 or 6 years since we've been going there, I think probably about 1/4 to 1/3 of the plain that was grass when we started is now under crops. This is a recent Landsat image. There's a problem with the Landsat sensor. It's got these black lines across it, but you can see clearly where these crops are. They're very easy to spot by satellite. They're very sort of straight-edged crops. All this area up here, all these brown bits in here are all croplands now. And this is a couple of years ago. If we did it again, we'd see that this area of crops here now goes right, covers this whole area here. And the green dots are where we recorded birds in June 2010, and you can see that none of them were on crops. Overgrazing. This was taken a couple of years ago during the drought. You can see how thin the cows are. Barana culture insists that during a drought you can take your cows to other areas of grassland and that people there have to let you graze. It's a kind of insurance policy. And of course, with the Liben Plains being just about the only grassland left in the area, all the cows in the whole region descended on the Liben Plain. In fact, there was a talk of an enormous herd of 10,000 cattle moving up that way from Kenya. Thankfully, it never got there. But you can see the problem. You can see the grazing density here is absolutely astonishing, and you can see how thin these cows are. This is a nest. We found about nests in the last few years. They're not that hard to find, but we tried to avoid disturbing the birds. But this is a nest we stumbled across, and you can see how exposed that is. I mean, any predator walking past that would find an easy meal. The chicks were hardly covered. You can see this is taken from above the nest, and this is about an 8-day-old chick, and you can see it's hardly covered at all. And not surprisingly, I think a lot of these nests get predated. It's quite an interesting, fantastic photo, this, isn't it, by Andy Swash? There's a very interesting story. If you look at the length of the claw here, Just by looking at that, you know that this is a species that requires tall, extensive grass. Remember the picture I showed you at the beginning showed the bird standing on the grass, not on the ground next to it, but on the grass. And there's a very strong relationship between the length of the hind claw in larks and the kind of substrate they use. So species that like living on grass have these extremely long spurs, lark spurs, whereas species like the Somali short-toed lark, there's a clue in the title, short-toed lark, which occur on bare ground, have these very short hind toes. And this species now is very much commoner on the Liben Plain than the Heteromerapha, the Liben Lark is, because of all these areas of bare ground. So this species, with its short toes and preference for bare ground, it seems to be taking over the Liben Plain from the longer-toed grassland Liben lark. So you can tell just by looking at the feet of these larks what kind of habitat they want. And I mentioned already, this is Acacia drepanalobium, and this is extending into the grassland from the east. We have had some great successes, actually. We've cleared a lot of this, and within a year of it being cleared, larks have moved back into these cleared areas. So what we're doing at the moment is this whole area here, we're going to be clearing, and may even already have happened, and we're hoping that when we go back, this will have opened up some grassland for the larks. Of course, it will also have helped open up some grassland for people wanting to plant cereals as well. So the solutions are to reduce grazing pressure, to clear scrub. We're supporting local pastoralist groups there. Of course, you know, they want the grassland for a different reason. Their livelihoods depend on it, but you know, we have the same wishes, the same aspirations. Protecting grassland, raising awareness. We're working with the local school there to develop an environmental awareness education programme. We're monitoring the population, and Brooke Tarwich is doing her PhD trying to find out more about this species. So about 4 years ago, we paid for local people to cut down a load of drepanalobium scrub in the eastern part of the plain, then bring it over here to the western part of the plain and build this 4-hectare exclosure. And this worked tremendously well. And what this showed us, this is just a few months after keeping the cows out. You can see the difference in the grass heights. And this was perfect. There were Liben larks singing over this. Unfortunately, when the drought came along a couple of years later, the local people, obviously, they couldn't sit there and see all this lovely grass, and so they opened it up, and it's now gone. But what this did prove to us, at least, was that all the seeds, the seed bank is there to restore the grassland. So this isn't irrevocably damaged. If we can reduce the grazing pressure, all this lovely, tall grassland will come back. So we're working with local pastoralists. I don't know, maybe many of you will know Nigel Collar here. This is Kariuki and Danganga from the BirdLife Regional Secretariat in Nairobi, who's overseeing the project, Kiragu Mwangi from BirdLife in Cambridge, and we're facilitating these workshops of local pastoralists to try and help them have more of a say in how the plain is managed and help them try and reduce the loss of grassland to crops. This is the local school. It's, I have to say, a pretty miserable place, really. Most kids only go there because they get a meal of maize meal at lunchtime. There's no facilities at all there. So we're hoping to provide some facilities. We're hoping to run a fresh water supply. It doesn't look like they need it there, but in the hot season, of course, there's no fresh water there, so we're hoping to run a fresh water supply through there. This is Brooke Tarwich here, by the way, who should have been standing in front of you today. And Brooke Tarwich's research is based upon assessing breeding success, which we think is currently very low, looking at the socioeconomics of how people use the plain, what the motivations are for pastoralists, what the motivations are for agriculturalists, and so on. Whether or not Liben larks can use crops, we actually did get some observations recently of birds feeding in cereals, and it may well be that they're capable of feeding in cereals and they only need grassland for nesting in. We're looking at seasonal patterns of habitat use. We've only really been there during the breeding season. We don't know what these larks are doing during the dry season. They only nest after raining. We're really hoping that the situation around here becomes safe enough for us to go and do some surveys there. We really don't know anything at all about that population. And using all these things to try and develop some conservation options. So as I say, we've actually seen birds feeding in cereal. This is the first photograph, this is the first bird we saw. This, believe it or not, is a wheat crop. I mean, you can see how sparse it is. It wouldn't pass muster in East Anglia. But this bird seemed to be feeding there. And what happens is the grass patches between the crops, because the people keep cows off, the grass patches between the crops actually grow very tall because the cattle are kept away because they obviously don't want them eating the crops. So maybe they can hang on there in these areas if there are these strips of tall grass between the cereal crops, and that's one of the things that Brooke Tarwich looking at the moment. Now, we all know that there are 1,001 uses for hyena dung. We're actually using hyena dung now as a conservation method. So what we find occasionally as we walk across the plain is that you get these little patches, maybe the size of that table, of much taller, denser, thicker grass, like these little oases. And when you look inside them, you always find some hyena dung. So what happens is occasionally you get spotted hyenas crossing the plain, defecating, and cattle won't go near hyena dung because of the smell. So what happens is you get this little patch of hyena dung protected grassland, and we've often seen birds hanging around these, and we think that they may be associating with them because it's like good nesting cover for these birds. But of course the danger then is that if you create these little oases, the birds get to use them, but the predators latch onto it as well. So you may actually be encouraging these birds into a trap. The predators might walk past and think, well, this looks like a good place for a nest, I'll go and have a look. So what we're doing now is, this is Brooke Tarr, we're doing this little experiment with false nests. These are homemade nests made by her mum, bless, and these little plasticine eggs. And what she's doing is she's putting these down as an experiment, and next to some of them she's putting hyena dung, and next to others she's not putting hyena dung. She's looking at the rates of predation of those that are next to hyena dung and those that aren't. And I'm afraid if she'd been here today, she'd have been able to give you some of the results of that, but I'm afraid I haven't got them. But she's put hundreds and hundreds of these little nests out around the plain and keeps going back and checking. And of course, because these eggs are plasticine, if anything, any predator tries to bite them, you get the tooth marks. So we can use skulls from museums to match up the tooth marks to the marks on these plasticine eggs. So here we are. This is hyena dung, and this is one of her artificial nests here. And the predators seem to be fooled by these because quite a lot of these artificial nests are getting munched and with like tooth marks in them, probably mongoose, I think, mostly. So that's where we are at the moment. I mean, I'll just reiterate just how threatened I think this. I wouldn't, I mean, we're doing everything we can. I wouldn't be surprised if we lose this species in the next 10 to 20 years. And, you know, coming back to what I said at the beginning of this talk, it would be Africa's first ever recorded mainland bird extinction. So this is really quite a serious issue. We've been very lucky that we've got quite considerable amount of funding for this project now through the UK British Bird Fair. I think it was 4 years ago now, the Bird Fair had as its theme Southern Ethiopia's threatened endemic birds. So the work we're doing on the Liben Lark is part of a bigger project, which is also looking at some of these other enigmatic Southern Ethiopian species, the Ethiopian bush crow, which I think you had a talk about, Nigel gave on my behalf last year, white-tailed swallow, Ruspolis, Prince Ruspolis, Turako, and then there's this bizarre thing called Netchsar nightjar, which is so far only known from this one wing. So I'll leave it there with just a list of all the many people who've contributed to this work, and there's probably many more whose names I've forgotten to put on there. But thanks to them, and thanks to you for listening.
Very much indeed. We've got time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. We've got a microphone at each end. Raise your hand now. We'll get a microphone to you, and there's one down here in the second row. We'll come to you in just a sec. Quick question from me. You talk about the hyena dung. Is there a way of recreating the smell of the dung artificially so that you don't have to pile up dung, you can pile up something else?
There is, and in fact it's predator dung is sold commercially, so some of the stuff that you buy to keep cats out of the garden is based upon the same smells and pheromones as there are in predator dung. We're using lion dung as well because we've made a nice contact with the zoo in Addis, and they've got this very productive lion. The hyena dung we have to go all the way to Harare to get, and the problem we have when collecting it is that people think we're using it for witchcraft. So we have to be very careful about it, and we have to be very careful not to let people on the plain see us putting it down, because they'll think that we're trying to spook the cattle and curse the place. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. But yes, you can get, there are commercially available deterrents based upon predator dung, yeah.
That's enough talk on dung. Second row.
Hello. Do you know anything about the predator...
Hang on, the microphone's not working. There you go. Try again.
Hello. Do you know anything about the predator density, if that's increased in recent years, or is predation just...
Yes, I'll repeat the question. She's asking about whether we know anything about the density of predators on the plain and whether it's increased. We don't, I'm afraid. I mean, these predators are almost certainly nocturnal. And we have tried running some night transects out there using flashlights to detect eye shine. We've seen a few mongoose. I think it's going to probably be easier to determine what predators are out there by looking at the teeth marks in these plasticine eggs. But in terms of trends of predators out there, we don't know anything at all. We've asked local people, and they don't have any strong opinion either way on it. No, these are native, yes, native predators, yeah. But I mean, if these larks are anything like skylarks, which I've studied in quite a lot of detail here, pretty much anything will eat their eggs. Pretty much any rodents, you know, porcupines might eat them, and anything really.
Okay. Got a question on the other roving mic.
Yes, I'm just back from there actually.
All right.
The present state of the grassland is much browner and much more degraded than shown in your photographs. So obviously, perhaps it's, I think we were just in the short range or something.
Yes, yeah.
Overgrazing seems to be a problem throughout the whole country, really. There seems to be no respect for the borders of national parks and this sort of thing.
That's absolutely right, yes. I mean, the amount of grassland is shrinking everywhere, and for two reasons, actually. So firstly, it's because grassland's a very easy habitat to convert into something else. It's nice and flat, and you don't have tree roots to dig out and stuff like that. But also because of as I understand it, because there's a wobble in the Earth's orbit, the planet goes through phases of being better for grassland or less good for grassland. So the world's grasslands have expanded and contracted naturally over time because of this wobble in the Earth's orbit. And that influences whether it's more productive for plants to store their carbon above ground or below ground. And at the moment, we're in a period of natural grassland recession. So we've got this kind of, that's partly why this scrub is encroaching. So we've got conditions where it's not very good naturally for grasslands anyway, added to which there's this accelerated loss of grasslands to agriculture and all sorts of other things. But I mean, in terms of the Liben Plain itself, I mean, I was out there in November last year, and I was quite pleasantly surprised by the condition of the grassland. And it may well be that if you've just been out there, that the short rains didn't happen this year and that it's all parched. But we normally go there after the rains because that's when the birds nest, and you know. That's kind of typical. That's how I think of the plains, those photographs. But the pictures I've seen from Jijiga suggest more like what you're saying, sort of brown dust bowl type habitat. Yeah.
There's a question down here, gentleman on the turquoise. We'll try the mic again, see if it works this time.
Are there possibilities here for translocating birds to other grassland areas where they might survive?
It's possible. I mean, I think if there were other grassland areas that were suitable, they would be there. I think this is a species that formerly had a much, much bigger distribution. And in fact, you know, this species probably was contiguous and the same species a long time ago as Rudd's lark. So there was this kind of dry grassland corridor that linked the arid areas of East Africa with the arid areas of Southern Africa, you know, tens of thousands of years ago. And you get these kind of species pairs or single species that occur in East Africa and South Africa with nothing in between. A bit like this Heteromerophora larks. And essentially what these are just relics of what was formerly a much, much bigger range. So the environmental niche modelling that we've done suggests that there aren't any suitable environments anywhere else. Of course, if they're capable of using different sorts of habitats to what they're using now, there could be populations elsewhere. All the model can look for is places that are similar to where it is now. And if it has a wider kind of habitat use. We did find a huge area of grassland, and we found it. We went to and saw for ourselves a huge area of grassland west of Yabelo called the Southern Plain, a massive area of grassland. I immediately thought, well, this could be good, but we haven't found it there. So I think we have to work on the assumption that these are the only two populations left, without really knowing very much about the Jijiga population.
Another question over there on the other microphone.
As the crops, such as wheat, are actually grasses,
Yeah.
and the birds would find predation a lot harder on more protection on the nests, why don't they actually use the crops?
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, you could say, you know, why aren't skylark densities really high in winter cereals, and they're just not. I think partly because you don't have the vertical, you have vertical height, but you don't have any cover. So in other words, if you look down in a modern cereal crop, you can see the ground from pretty much wherever you are, and there are no weeds there or no cover on the ground level. And it may also be that the food levels are much, much lower. So one of the things that Brooke's going to be doing, she's going to be putting pitfall traps out to measure insect diversity and abundance in the grassland and compare that with what's in the crops. But I mean, you're right. But having said that, if they could survive in cereals, then it wouldn't be that rare a bird, because there's a lot of cereals in that area.
If I could just ask one final question. I mean, a lot of problems in Ethiopia. People there have a tough life.
Yes, indeed.
What is there for them in this?
Well, I think in this particular case, it's one of those happy coincidences where what we want is what the local people want as well. They want healthy grassland for their livelihoods, for their cattle. We want healthy grassland for the Liben lark. So, in a way, you know, we could almost sell this as a kind of development, sustainable development project, because essentially we're looking for the same thing.
So why are you so downbeat on the fact that it might
because the odds are stacked against them politically and economically. So the people who are coming in with money to invest in buying cereals have more economic clout behind them, these pastoralists do. These pastoralists don't really have a voice, which is why we're very actively supporting these pastoralist associations. Two of them, in fact, we're supporting. But they fight with the investors who come to plant crops. They throw stones at them, and you know it could get quite nasty. But a lot of the pastoralists are saying, well, yeah, we can't beat them, so we're going to start ploughing as well, and they're doing that. So
you're staying around today. You're not running off, are you?
No. I'll be here all day.
Paul will be around lunchtime, but for the time being, please join me in thanking him for an excellent talk.
Thank you.